Hello, and welcome to the History of Egypt podcast. This week we have a special bonus episode. I did a live Q&A over on my Patreon, in which folks could come on and ask anything they liked about ancient Egyptian culture or history. We covered some fun topics like the mysterious Canal of the Pharaohs, how common was the practice of tattooing, whether the pharaoh was literally a god on earth, and some of my personal recommendations for books and awesome exhibits at the Grand Egyptian Museum. If you want to jump around to specific questions, I've put time codes in the episode description, along with some links to books or scholarship that I reference in the episode. This is the first time I've done a live Q&A, but it went quite well, so I'm thinking of doing them more often in the future over on my Patreon. Anyways, I hope you enjoy. So Patrick asked me, what are my top 3 books related to Egyptology? And if none of those include a complete history of ancient Egypt, what book do I think covers the entirety of ancient Egyptian history the best? Okay. This one was relatively difficult to answer, I have to say, because I tend to go through books sort of piece by piece. It's very rare that I sit down and read an academic book cover to cover, because I'm usually going through and following up on the details. But I'll start with the complete history. I think in terms of the most recent and most accessible as a single volume, I would still recommend Toby Wilkinson's Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt, because that one goes basically from the beginning of the kingdom to the Greco-Roman era in a very broad sweep, but with just enough detail that you get some good information. And it strikes a really good balance between providing new details that you might not have learned from your average documentaries or things, but it doesn't get bogged down in too much detail. So I would probably recommend that one. If you want something a bit more substantial, I would recommend John Romer's 3-volume so far History of Ancient Egypt. The first one goes from the pre-dynastic up to the middle of the 4th dynasty with Khufu and the Great Pyramid. The second volume covers the just after Khufu, the rest of the Old Kingdom, to the end of the middle. And then the third volume covers the second intermediate period and the New Kingdom up to the end of Dynasty 21. That one I would recommend as like a intermediate level for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it is much more detailed. And second, Romer gets a lot more into historiography and the history of Egyptology, not as like a dry history, but more in the assumptions that Egyptology has made historically about certain questions, where they come from, why they are often not necessarily based on sound scholarship, and where the science needs to move to rectify those gaps. So it's much more critical in the sense of it engages with the field and sort of works through some of those questions. But that's a really good one if you want to get deeper into Egyptology as a more nuanced thing. For me, I think my favorite recently would be Peter Brand's Ramesses, Egypt's Ultimate Pharaoh, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, considering how famous Ramesses is, there hadn't really been a thorough biography of him since the early 1980s with Kenneth Kitchen's book. But even Kenneth Kitchen's biography of Ramesses was quite slim, only like 200 pages tops, whereas Peter Brand's is like 600 pages. It's a nice doorstop, and it's really thorough. And on a personal level, through undergrad and early postgrad, I had I didn't have that much interest in Ramesses personally. He just seemed too big and too overdone and too grandiose. And, I think probably this is quite common with undergraduates and the more experienced Egyptologists. People do get kind of jaded on certain historical figures who they just have to keep talking about or keep encountering in the public discourse. It's quite common for Egyptologists to be a little bit bored of Ramesses or Akhenaten or Tutankhamun or the Exodus, or even like the Great Pyramid, or pyramids in general. Those ones which keep coming up constantly, people naturally get a little bit jaded on. And I think I had a little bit of that with Ramesses, but Peter Brand's book really opened my eyes to how much more interesting stuff actually was going on behind that grandiose facade. The second one I chose as kind of a cheating, in the same way that The Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite novels, the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt. It's 3 volumes, but it's basically just a really good encyclopedia with every chapter being written by a specialist in the respective topic. It's a little bit out of date now because it was published in the early 1990s. At present, the only project that's trying to replace it is the UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology. And I wouldn't recommend that for casual interests because it's entirely online and it doesn't have a very good user interface yet. It doesn't even have like a browse by topic thing. You have to like know exactly the title that you want to search for. Totally very difficult to use unless you're a specialist. So for somebody who's, just dipping their toes into this field or wants to get slightly deeper without going full student level, I think the Oxford Encyclopedia is really good. And that's my cheating answer to my top 3.
Bing bong, Dominic from the future here. After the live stream, I went and Googled the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt, and it seems to be out of print now and is wildly expensive online. But fortunately, somebody has uploaded the 3 volumes to the Internet Archive, so you can download it and read it for free. I'll put a link in the episode description for those who are interested.
So raise your hand. Okay, Miriam was the first to raise your hand, so let me just go ahead, Miriam.
Well, I submitted a question. It was late in the evening, though, so probably overnight for you. But it's about the KV5 tomb.
Oh, yes.
Do you know is there any other evidence that there's any other kind of like royal family crypt anywhere, either in the Valley of the Kings or Saqqara or some other place that has obviously not quite as large layout as that, but just like, oh, here are all the sons, or here are all the daughters of the king, or that sort of thing?
Okay. Yeah. KV5 is definitely a weird one. And the reason it's weird is because it's so very explicitly a tomb for the royal children. Like it's described, it's got multiple princes within the galleries, and there are semi-contemporary documents from Deir el-Medina that mention it or name it as the tomb of the royal children. Unfortunately, it's also unique in that respect. So everything I'm about to say is basically speculative based on maybe. One of the big interpretations I saw for the step pyramid, for the underground galleries, which if you're not familiar, the step pyramid has very extensive passageways and halls underneath it, like much larger than any other pyramid. And at least one interpretation that I think is not terrible is that some of those subsidiary chambers may have been intended for extended members of Jose's family. Unfortunately, there were no burials discovered in those galleries, and there's no inscriptional evidence to say that is what they're for. Another argument that I saw is that they may have been intended for the Apis bulls, because we know the Apis cult was active from the first dynasty, and yet the earliest evidence we have for them burying them and mummifying them to some degree starts in the 18th. So where are the intervening centuries of Apis bulls? One interpretation I saw of the step pyramid is that those galleries may have been intended for that. In the royal sphere, certainly a couple of the Middle Kingdom pyramids have secondary chambers that seem to be intended for queens. And also pyramids like the Senuserites, they have the smaller side pyramids, which were for royal children, a couple of which were discovered with burial goods inside. But no, generally, as far as I'm aware, KV5 is the first time we really see quite explicitly a large monument being constructed. I'm not aware of any other New Kingdom or earlier example that we could definitively point to. It seems like they mostly tried to do their own tombs individually. It's just that Ramesses had way too many children and couldn't feasibly do that. Yeah.
Indeed. Thank you.
No worries. Anyone else want to raise your hand? Okay, Chrissy, you're on.
Yes, I was wondering if you could speak on tattooing in ancient Egypt.
What about it specifically? Like how it was done? Or
Yeah, and who received it, what it was for, anything you
okay,
got, babe.
anything I've got. Cool. Um, yeah, it's not a very widely attested practice, surprisingly. There is at least one pre or early dynastic mummy who has a tattoo on their leg, I believe it is.
Right.
And I think there's one or two from the New Kingdom who might have it. But it's the problem with tattoos is that, even in life, they kind of fade.
Right.
Then you chuck in a bunch of dehydrating salts and oils and ointments and resins that blacken and sort of desiccate the skin. Sometimes it can be quite hard to tell, is that a tattoo or is that just a stain? That kind of thing. The other aspect of it is that there is an artistic element that might be relevant, but it's always very hard to tell. And building off that, it seems like the people who got tattoos, as far as we know from art, which obviously is a very formal thing that's being put into terms, so it's favoring a certain type of person, it seems like there were dancers and musicians related to the gods, particularly Bes.
Yep.
And they're the ones who seem to show up in art as having something that might be a tattoo on their arm or their thigh. It seems to be the other place. In the olden days, European scholars sort of jumped to the conclusion that it was a mark of prostitution or something, but we have no evidence for prostitution as a practice in ancient Egypt, so I don't even know how they got to that conclusion. Just Victorians being Victorians, But it does seem, at least from the art, that the context is music and performance, and it often has to do with Bes. So that might be the best information we have in terms of tattooing. Another argument that I have seen is related to scribal statues of the New Kingdom, particularly figures like Haramesu or Ramesses I, Horemheb, who has a really beautiful scribal statue in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And he has on his inner forearm, like around here, a reference to one of the deities. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure it's Jehuti, but it could also be Amun because the statue comes from Karnak, which has been speculated to be possibly a reference to a tattoo, or even if it's not a tattoo that Horemheb physically had, it's that they're placing it on this statue to evoke that concept as like a devotion to this particular deity. But until we find Horemheb's mummy and take a look at his arm, we can't say for sure. So yeah, it's a very murky practice as far as the archaeological and artistic record goes. I think there are a couple of scholars or at least one who is working on it right now. But I'll make a note of it now and put a note of it when I upload the recording of this. So at least I can point you in the direction of a scholar. Go ahead, Pat.
Hopefully a quick one. So the pharaohs were seen as gods on earth, and I was just wondering the other day, being in the UK and seeing the royal family, and the, it got me thinking as to, for example, the way that the royal family is treated and fated to a certain degree. Everything that I've learned about Egypt thus far is that the pharaohs were sort of gods on earth, and it got me thinking when they were walking about, when they were in their world. Obviously, people were deferring to them by their arms out, heads to the ground, and all of that sort of stuff. It just got me thinking about, were they really? Sounds a stupid question. Were they really seen as gods on earth? And they would walk into a room and everybody dropped to the floor, and people actually believed that the pharaoh was semi-divine or divine almost. And I was yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the classic questions of Egyptian history, right? Is to what extent was the physical pharaoh, the human walking around, seen as an actual deity, and how much was it viewed as metaphorical, if you will? there are a couple of things that, obviously with the preface that it changes over time. In the earliest periods, there's relatively little evidence for the nature of the king, as it were. It's only in the 4th dynasty that we start to get references to things like the son of Ra, coming in with Jedefra. And that basically kickstarts the idea that the king is the son or offspring of the rule of the sun god on earth. Skipping over the Old and Middle Kingdom entirely, in the New Kingdom, we do have so much more evidence, and that does allow some nuance in the interpretation. It seems, at least from the royal inscriptions, it seems like the Egyptians understood the basic tension or dichotomy between the physical vessel or human and the divine power and godhood that he was embodying. And they encapsulated that in the phrase Chem-F, or his person or his incarnation, often translated as his majesty in popular works. So if you see a translation of an ancient text and it says his or her majesty, the ancient word is Chem-F, which literally means something like his incarnation. The essence of that is that they seem to have understood that the human on earth was mortal, but he did embody the ruling power and the divinity of Horus. And when he died, he would transfigure into Osir, or Osiris. It then starts to get more complicated when we get down into questions of like courtly etiquette, because we don't have any description of the court, really. We have strings of titles belonging to courtiers. We have letters from foreign rulers, especially vassals, that give a hint of the deference. And one of the things that commonly shows up in the Amana letters is the idea that the vassal or the subordinate of the king, his subject, proskynates or is down on the ground before them and views the king as the illumination or the incarnation of Ra. Unfortunately, we simply don't have any documentation to say how far that actually extended into the day-to-day functionings of the court. I think it's a fair guess that people would be bowing as soon as the monarch entered a room. They might be permitted to stand up subsequently and go about their business as usual. But I think at least in a ceremonial occasion or any official public appearance, it was probably that kind of thing. But we just can't say for sure. So,
Bing bong, Dominic from the future again. One thing I will add is that starting in the 18th dynasty, and especially the Amana period, we do see art in tombs that shows the monarch standing tall, while people before him bow almost bent double, and in some cases, like Seti I, even the king will bow before the gods. So artistically, there is some precedent for imagining folks bowing and looking to the ground when in the presence of the monarch, but how far that extends into all interactions is a matter of speculation. But that's something worth adding.
Unfortunately, in terms of the daily etiquette of the Egyptian court, there is a massive gap there. There's a lot of questions, because if anybody wrote it down, that hasn't survived, unfortunately, yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No worries. Chrissy, you had a second question, and then we'll go to Lindy.
Actually, I just was wondering about linen. How do we know how they made it, especially the real sheer stuff? I mean, it seems such a laborious, I don't know. Yeah. Anything on linen?
Sure. I'll preface that with, this is not my specialty, but from a historical perspective, it seems like one of the common things that women did in the house was weaving and production of linen. And there are traces of evidence from the palace at Fayum, which is called Gurob, often called the harem or harem palace, but I don't really like that term anymore. But anyway, it seems to be a domestic palace, especially focused on the royal women. And archaeological excavations there, especially in the late 1800s and in the 1990s and recently, have found trace elements of things related to linen and fabric production. And we do know from economic records that there was a special category of linen called royal linen or royal quality. So at the very least, there seems to be a cadre of either royal women or elite level weavers working in one of the royal palaces who are producing this particular type. And again, the diplomatic letters from the foreign kingdoms, they reference whole ranges of types of linen, and that seems to be a sort of royal luxury commodity. In terms of how they do it, how they did it, that's not something I can really explain right now, but I can make a note of it as something. I think that would make a really good sort of short video rather than audio description, because you need a lot of visual for, the weave and that kind of thing. So I'll make a note of that and try and do something visual for you in the near future. Okay, so Lindy, you were next in line, and then we'll go to Alice after that.
Hi, you have to excuse me, I'm a bit tired. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning over here in Australia. So my question is about sort of your learning journey of what do you think is sort of the most critical thing that you didn't quite get or you misunderstood earlier on when you were in undergrad or you've seen other people struggle with? And what helped you most kind of when you finally went, oh, I get that now?
That's an interesting question. Definitely the thing I struggled with initially in undergraduate was the language. For a couple of reasons. What it turned out subsequently that I had undiagnosed ADHD, which made I was unmedicated for that right up until my early PhD. So undergraduate was a struggle in lots of respects, especially for something like language where I need to do it, but I find it boring to sit down and do that. So I definitely struggled with the learning process of the language. I find the language itself quite interesting, but the learning of the grammar and that was a total snooze, and it was like pulling teeth. So I had to force myself to do that. In terms of misconceptions, gosh, we're thinking back 20 years now, so it's very difficult to remember the things that you misunderstood, because as soon as you've learned the correct information, you kind of just delete the misconception from your brain. The most common misconception I see about ancient Egypt, and I think it's one that I probably would have come into undergraduate with to some degree, is the misconception that it was unchanging or that it was static in terms of its art and culture. And it's a very easy misconception to have because from a pretty early part of their history, they seem to have the visual language of their two-dimensional art already set in stone, as it were. You look at the Nile palette, that's pretty similar to a smiting scene of Ramesses II. But the devil is in the details, and, things like the quality of carving, the sophistication of the hieroglyphs, the poses that get introduced and adapted. That's one of those things that as soon as you start diving down more into the details, you learn that there's Egyptian art and culture by design or intentionally was keeping this veneer of static tradition unchanging because there was a tradition handed down by the gods. So you don't want to change that. But as soon as you start getting into the details, you see, wow, there's a lot of change, and there's almost two layers of what's going on. They're sticking to the form, coloring inside the lines, as it were, but they are changing the lines quite subtly, but in quite sophisticated ways. But I think that would probably be the biggest misconception that I or somebody coming into undergrad would have, is how static it was, because it really wasn't. It was quite dynamic in a lot of ways. Yeah. So Alice, I believe you are next up.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alina, actually. I left my question also on Patreon, and it was about perfumes and incenses. I'm not sure I can join the second session, so if you have this answer and if you know anything about this one, I would love to hear it.
Yep. Perfumes are a complicated one. I do have your question here. It was specifically related to the Ramessid era. Unfortunately, most of our evidence for perfumery comes from the Greco-Roman period, with there's lovely, almost like recipes and descriptions on temples like Dendera, especially for Hathor. That might have existed in the New Kingdom version of that temple, but that temple was demolished and the Greco-Roman one was built in its place. So unfortunately, as far as I know, perfumery is very poorly attested prior to the Greco-Roman era. There are little hints of it with things like tomb art that give a sense of, lotuses as a sort of perfume thing that people often smell. But I can say that if you want to learn more about it, I did an interview a year or two ago with a scholar named Dora Goldsmith, who that's her focus. She works on perfumery as a research topic. So I would recommend looking up Dora Goldsmith and her works, that she puts everything that she publishes on academia.edu. So it's very easy to access. Unfortunately, for the New Kingdom and earlier, there really isn't much in terms of written records. I mean, we have things like incense, people like Hatshepsut, they talk about collecting myrrh or incense from places like Punt and cultivating it. So, I mean, if that counts as a perfume, or at least a scent, then that's really the best we have in terms of the New Kingdom material. Unfortunately, it's just not well preserved. Yeah. I should also say that, in the tomb of Tutankhamun, there were sort of traces of oils and unguents that were probably used as scented, body applications. To the best of my knowledge, though, nobody's done a residue test on those yet. I think they might have done some preliminary tests in the 1920s, but I'm not aware of anyone who's done that in the modern era. But that would be an interesting thing to look up. So I will make a note of that in terms of following up whether anyone's done the Tutankhamun stuff yet, but I don't think they have.
Thank you. So that was not my fault that I couldn't find anything. Thank you.
No, not at all. There really isn't that much. Okay. Miriam again, welcome.
Hi. Since you were mentioning earlier that you knew Patrick because of being on a tour together, I thought, I've read on, descriptions of, touring Egypt, this, that, and the other thing. And now that the Gem is open, the Grand Egyptian Museum, they say, we will spend the day at the Grand Egyptian Museum. And I've heard other people say that it's such a huge edifice. How many, in your opinion, how many days do you think it would take to do it justice of taking a tour of that museum itself?
If you turned up at opening, you could very easily go until closing at about 5 or 6 and not feel like you'd seen everything in as much detail as you could. I think you could either do one day very intensely, or you could do 2 days lightly, not pushing yourself, because museums can be quite overwhelming. You can get quite burnt out. But I think if you were visiting Egypt for the first time as an enthusiast, then I would say go to the Gem for one full day, but also make time to go to the Old Museum in Tahrir Square, and probably the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization out in Eastern Cairo, where you can see not just ancient Egypt, but also medieval and early modern, and you can see the royal mummies, and they have the textile museum in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. Really beautiful clothing from all periods, linens, things like that. If you thought you were only coming to Egypt once, then maybe spend a day and a half or 2 days at the Gem, and don't push yourself too much, because otherwise you'll burn out. I think a day and a half is plenty, unless you're literally, spending minutes in front of each and every object, which you're probably not, because even if you're an enthusiast, there's only so many statues of a king that you can look at before they start to blur together. So I think a day and a half is more than enough. The challenge with the Gem is really how much time you would want to spend in front of each artifact. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And now, part 2.
Come in with a question from somebody who just commented on the post just before. Someone called Omens Fan asked for a recommendation of a book about Egyptian gods or myths, which is a proper, serious adult one, not a child's version. The one that I would recommend is there's two of them that I think are both good. One is called Egyptian Mythology, A Traveler's Guide by Gary Shaw. And the reason I like that one is that it does it geographically. So it focuses on each of the major cult centers for particular deities, Horus, Iset, Osiris, things like that, and kind of explains the myths temple by temple, which I think is quite a good approach because obviously if all of these Egyptian deities have their particular houses, so why not explain them in the context of their houses? Another one that's pretty good is Joyce Tildesley's book of Egyptian myths. She doesn't, make it child-friendly or anything like that. It's all the necessary details. So Joyce Tildesley's Egyptian myths or Egyptian mythology is also quite good. And that question was from Omen's Fan. So if you're here, thank you. Cass, or K-A-S, Cass, asked, what is the preferred pronunciation for the sun god Ra or Re? Which one is it? I go back and forth. These days, I mostly say Ra, but in the Ramessid era, so around the time of Ramesses II, we do have the cuneiform letters from the Hittite kingdom, which address Ramesses by name. And obviously his name includes the word Ra. And the way they spell it, or the way their syllable writing conveys it, is Ria. They don't call him Ramesses, they call him Ria Mesesa or Ria Meshesha. So at least by the time of Ramesses II, it may have been pronounced something more like Ria. So Dana Lisa asked about mortuary temples. Specifically, is there a sense of how long the cults of deceased pharaohs lasted? Was there a process for decommissioning these temples when the cult died out? The second part of that question, decommissioning, we don't know because there's no specific description of that process. Working from the archaeology, we can say that statues might be dismantled, even cut up to be used as masonry for new complexes, and in some cases the names might be removed to kind of ritually deactivate the statue. As for how long the cults of deceased rulers lasted, that does vary by king. So some rulers enjoyed quite a long posthumous reputation. Others, their cults died out relatively quickly. But specifically with regards to the mortuary temples, it's quite variable, and we don't have a strong understanding of the posthumous life, as it were. For like an old kingdom example, we know for instance that Unas of the 5th dynasty, his burial chamber in his pyramid has at least four or six alabaster or travertine blocks on the walls that have come from the memorial temple, most likely of Khufu. And they very carefully erased the art, but if you shine a light on it at just the right angle, you can still see the shadow of the original art. Now, Khufu lived about 150 to 200 years after, Unas lived about 150 to 200 years after Khufu. So that tells us that Khufu's memorial cult did not last that long in the big picture. Maybe something to do with his posthumous reputation as being not the nicest king, perhaps, but who's to say? Mortuary temples, we don't really know what the process was for decommissioning them. There does seem to have been one. It's just not described in any inscription. So we have to work from little archaeological clues. Okay, now Kate asks about dwarfs. Specifically, are there any records about the pygmy that was brought to King Pepi II? She hopes he had a good long life. Unfortunately, we don't know anything about this pygmy, other than the fact that Pepi II was very excited to meet him and ordered Harkuf to make careful provisions for his transport. And those are carved on the walls of the outer facade of Harkuf's mortuary or tomb chapel at Kubet el-Hawa in Elephantine. Unfortunately, we don't know anything about the pygmy apart from that letter. There aren't enough records from Pepi II's court or wider society to give any indication of what happened to him. But it does seem that during the Old Kingdom, at least, dwarfs did have relatively high status in the court. They were used as, porters and servants and caretakers. And I would assume that this pygmy, if he learned the Egyptian language and did not cause any trouble, he probably would have had a fairly comfortable life. Adrian has popped his hand up. Go ahead, Adrian. Pop your microphone on.
Not too far from the pygmy question. You've touched a little bit on the absorption or not of sort of other people into Egyptian society. And I'm thinking, like the sort of the Bedouins were always out there, and of course Nubians and Libyans and others. Is there any art or anything that do we have any reason to believe that sometimes some of those folks could actually become prominent members of society or anything, be kind of fully integrated? Or what do we know about that?
Could foreigners become prominent members, do you mean?
Basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in the New Kingdom is when it's best attested. There are inscriptions for quite a lot of people in the Ramesside period who have names that, at the very least, speak to Syrian, Canaanite, and Southern heritage. They'll have names like, Pa-Nehesi, Pacharu, which mean Pa-Nehesi means the Nubian, Pacharu means the Syrian. There's names with like gods and goddesses from Canaan, particularly like Anat, Astarte, Baal, who show up and are referenced. Probably the best example on your angle of prominence in society is one of Akhenaten's viziers, or the Chatti, the kind of his prime minister. His name was Aper-El, which off the top of my head is like servant of the god or the Lord. He seems to be Canaanite or Syrian, and he's the most prominent official in Akhenaten's court. Very clearly quite an influential man, and everything we know about him, he has a tomb at Saqqara that was discovered in the late 80s or early 90s, and now a lot of his burial goods are in the Imhotep Museum in Saqqara. So Aper-El is probably the best example of somebody like that. But in short, yes, foreigners could rise quite high in Egyptian society. The tricky thing about pharaonic art and iconography is that it presents an image of permanent, eternal victory and crushing the forces of chaos. But at the end of the day, that's a facade. It doesn't necessarily reflect their actual interactions with people of non-Egyptian descent. Once you drill down into the written material and the archaeological record, it's clear that foreign integration was quite a thing in ancient Egypt. They weren't too concerned about that as long as people obeyed. Basically, as long as people obeyed the pharaoh and didn't cause trouble, then they were fine. A really good example, actually, that I just remembered is one of Ramesses II's sons, a lesser son. I forget which number. There's a record that suggests this prince married a girl whose father was Syrian and a boat captain, and that doesn't seem to have been an issue. So there was no real problem with foreigners within Egyptian society. It's just that the pharaonic state has this facade of conquest and victory, and that outsiders must be defeated. Once they're defeated, they can be integrated, no problem. Okay, one more from the comment. Jeff asked, I would like to know more about Beketaten, possibly the youngest daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen T. Could Beketaten be the mother of Tutankhamun? Possibly. We don't know. At the end, the big challenge with the Amarna royal family is that there's just too many gaps. There's too many ifs or maybes and uncertainties. Beketaten didn't leave a particularly strong record in the art. She's there, but we don't really know anything about her. As to whether she could be the mother of Tutankhamun, it's possible, but we simply have no way of saying for now, unfortunately. Okay, keeping on the foreign angle, Dan asked, Having studied Canaanite archaeology religious iconography in Canaan is almost entirely Egyptian in style, at least up to Ramesses II and slightly later. Do you see any evidence of Canaanite religious influence on Egyptian religion in this period? Are the associations of Assur with Sur and Hathor with Gebal more likely to be Egyptian to Canaanite or vice versa? It's always nearly impossible to say which direction starts it. It's a chicken and egg kind of question. Certainly, Canaanite influence is present in Egypt, no questions asked, in terms of religion. One that I'm going to cover on the podcast soon, once, as sort of part of a larger religious survey of the Ramesside period, is a record that Ramesses II left at Pi-Ramesses, but it was discovered at Tanis. It's a large stela, and it shows Ramesses making an offering to the god Sutek, or Seth, but Sutek doesn't appear in his animal-headed Egyptian male form. He appears dressed as the Canaanite and Syrian god Baal. He's got the robes, the Canaanite robes, and this slightly unusual or slightly distinct hat or helmet, and he's got a human head, but the hieroglyphs make it very clear he is Sutek, or Seth, and yet he's appearing in a Canaanite form. So yes, there is Canaanite influence definitely within the Egyptian religion in this period. And you have stories, like the tale of two brothers and the doomed prince, or even going further back, the tale of Sinuhe and Osiris, where many of the great events often take place along the Canaanite or Syrian coastline. I think, although it's impossible to say which direction started, or, where it was coming from initially, there's very clearly a great deal of exchange going on between those two groups in the north, at least in the northern part of Egypt, which geographically makes sense. That's much closer to Canaan. In the south, of course, with the Theban records, we do tend to see a stronger association of, like, Amun is more closely affiliated with Nubia, especially some of the southern holy sites. Amun is much more strongly associated with there. So it's that classic north-south divide of Egyptian society and politics is also visible in the religion. That, I believe, brings me to the end of the questions. Actually, there is one more by S. Mill, who asked about the rise of the solar worship Sol Invictus in Rome in the 3rd century, whether that could be related to fascination with Egyptian religion. This one I can't answer because I haven't done any research on Sol Invictus or 3rd century Roman religion. To the best of my knowledge, the Isis temple in Pompeii is probably the best example. There's more in the late 1st century BCE and early 1st century AD. So I'm not sure what's going on by the time of the 3rd century Roman cult. I think, if I think back to my undergraduate days studying Roman history, the rise of solar worship in third century Rome is often connected more with things like Mithras and the Near Eastern cults like Elagabal from Syria or Canaan. So with this particular question, Sol Invictus, I don't know anything about Sol Invictus in the 3rd century Roman Empire, so I'm afraid I can't answer that one. That's a bit too far beyond where my research has reached for now. But I've made a note of it, so I will definitely tackle it down the line. So that is all of the questions I got from the comments section. So now I'm going to open up the floor. So basically, when you have a question that you're happy to answer either on camera or on microphone, just use the raise your hand function, and I'll unmute sequentially. I'll call on you. So we'll go with Adrian first. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Earlier this year, I went on one of Dominic's tours, and the one that went through Nubia, and we visited a lot of Nubian sites. And you haven't done one of the tours, I can't recommend it highly enough. But it was interesting. The thing that I absolutely did not expect was how prominent in the different temples and other sites we visited were local gods, essentially. Mixed in with all of the gods that we're hearing about a lot on the podcast were, these in Elephantine there was a brother and sister, and various locations we heard about different variations on local gods, and they were very prominent in all of the facilities we visited and everything. So I'm assuming that was probably the case, throughout Egypt. I haven't been to a lot of sort of the things between Elephantine and Cairo, so I haven't seen what's in those sites. But is that generally the case? And like, I'm curious too, like on the coast or out in the oases, are there sites there where there's local gods that are featured in the temples, even if they're primarily about sort of the conventional main gods or whatever you would call them?
Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's a good question. Thanks, Adrian. The short answer is yes. All of the thing with the Egyptian gods is that basically, apart from Amun, Ra, the high pantheon deities, most of the gods are relatively local in how much they turn up. More from a practical perspective than anything. Every god has their house, and their house is located in a particular region, so that's where they're most prominent. For example, Hapi, he doesn't really have major temples of his own, but he's quite prominent at sites like Jebel Silsila and Aswan, where they thought parts of the Nile flood emerged from underground caverns. So Hapi is most visible at those little centers. Out in the oases, for example, there are temples to Sutek or Seth, who was the lord of the deserts and the master of the storm. A famous example is Hathor has her shrine out in the Sinai desert at the copper mines in Serabat el-Kadim. Every local center does have its own unique flavors of gods who show up. If you go to Abydos, for instance, you'll have Osir and Iset and Horus, but you'll also get a lot of references to deities like Anhur or Anurus and Jehuti or Thoth, because they were particularly prominent in that stretch of the Nile. So yes, different gods do show up prominently at different centers. Okay, Diana is next on the line. So Diana, when you're ready.
I have a question regarding the canal that was connecting the Nile to the Red Sea. That was, at least it was during Roman times. Was that dug by the Egyptians or by the Romans?
Yeah, that's a really uncertain question. Answer, unfortunately. To the best of my current knowledge, there's never been any archaeological evidence for this canal pre-Roman. So, if to excavate, if you found a canal stretch that had pottery of like the New or Old Kingdoms, that would give you more idea. But I've never seen any strong argument from any scholar, and certainly not one with any tangible evidence that the canal actually existed pre-Roman era.
Bing bong, Dominic from the future again. In terms of the texts and inscriptions, there are references to a canal during the Persian era, but archaeologically, there hasn't been any significant findings. And for the New Kingdom, it's entirely hypothetical.
You know how long it lasted? You know how long it existed?
The canal?
Yes.
The canal, you mean? Not yet. I haven't done nearly enough research on the Roman period to say that for sure. I don't know, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you.
Lindy, you are next up on the chopping block.
I was wondering your thoughts on unconscious bias in Egyptology. So, we always, when we look at the, back in the old days, and we go, all the bias that was there, we can see it clear as day. But what do you think are the biggest unconscious bias that are affecting us now? Like, I heard someone talk about the idea that we have a bit of a Theban bias because that's where things are best preserved. So yeah, what are your thoughts on those sorts of things?
That's a good question. The Theban bias is 100% a thing. It's a self-aware thing, but it's we are utterly trapped by the fact that the Theban material is so well preserved and yet the delta is so not well preserved. Even the Memphite, Saqqara is magnificent, but compared to the hills west of Thebes, the state of preservation at Saqqara is much lower, infinitely lower. So yes, the archaeological and thus historical bias towards Thebes or Waset or Luxor is very real, and people are trying to get away from it. Culturally, the biggest bias I would identify, which is that so much of it is being done by Europeans, Anglo-Americans, people from very particular cultural backgrounds. We kind of need more perspectives from, other African cultures or India or China and East Asian societies. We need more students and educators from there to be looking at things to bring in new perspectives, and that is happening. But I think you'll be very easy to make the case that there's been a Western bias in Egyptology, perhaps by nature of what it is. But I think we're moving past that.
That brings us to the end of the questions for this Q&A. I'd like to do another one in the future, so if you're interested in that, visit patreon.com/Egypt podcast. And if you have any questions that you would like answered, drop them in the comments for this episode, and I'll add them to my list. Thanks for listening. I'll see you soon.